In 1999, Teflon was in 90% of American kitchens. Think about that number, 9 out of 10 homes. More households than owned microwaves, more than had cable television. From Manhattan penthouses to trailer parks in rural Alabama, the same chemical miracle sat on the same stovetops, frying the same morning eggs. DuPont hadn't just created a product, they had woven themselves into the fabric of daily life. Non-stick pans, stain-resistant carpets, waterproof jackets, food wrappers, dental floss. The invisible chemistry of convenience touched Americans dozens of times a day without them ever knowing it. The company had survived 2 world wars. They had outlasted the Great Depression. They had navigated environmental scandals that destroyed lesser corporations. For over 200 years, DuPont had been synonymous with American chemical innovation, a name that meant progress itself. And then it all came apart. By 2017, DuPont had paid $670 million to settle claims from just one contaminated community. By 2023, the figure had grown to nearly $2 billion. By 2024, the federal government had declared their miracle chemical unsafe at almost any detectable level. 4 parts per trillion, a single drop in an Olympic swimming pool. A 50-year empire of silence, exposed in less than a decade. But here's what makes this story different from every other corporate scandal you've heard. The chemical at the center of it, C8, PFOA, the thing that made Teflon possible, was designed with one purpose: to never break down, to resist everything, to last forever. And it did. The same molecule that made DuPont billions is now in your blood. It's in your children's blood. It's in the blood of babies born today, in the blood of people who've never touched a nonstick pan, in the blood of communities that have never heard of Parkersburg, West Virginia. This is the story of how a chemical engineered to be indestructible became impossible to escape. How one company's greatest innovation became the world's most persistent mistake. And how the very property that made it so valuable, its refusal to react with anything, made it the most dangerous kind of poison, the kind you can never clean up. Some empires are built on oil. This one was built on a molecule designed to last forever. That was the selling point. It was also the crime. In 1948, along the banks of the Ohio River in West Virginia, a new industrial cathedral rose from the earth. DuPont called it Washington Works. The facility sprawled across the landscape like a small city, pipes and towers and smokestacks reaching toward the sky, a monument to American chemical ingenuity. At the time, no one in the surrounding communities of Parkersburg and Vienna and Lübeck thought much about what happened inside those walls. They knew it meant jobs, good jobs. The kind of jobs that let a man buy a house, raise a family, send his kids to college. In post-war America, a chemical plant wasn't something you questioned. It was something you thanked God for. 3 years later, in 1951, something changed inside Washington Works. DuPont began using a chemical compound in its manufacturing process, a substance that would eventually be known by many names. The scientists called it perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA. The workers on the floor called it C8, a shorthand for the 8 carbon atoms in its molecular chain. The marketing department didn't call it anything at all, because the public was never supposed to think about it. C8 wasn't the product, it was the secret ingredient that made the product possible. You see, DuPont had discovered something remarkable. When you take fluorine atoms and bond them to carbon in a particular way, you create a molecule that refuses to interact with almost anything else. Water beads off it, oil slides away, heat doesn't faze it, stains can't penetrate it. This was the chemical backbone of Teflon. But here's what most people didn't understand then, and what many still don't fully grasp today. The Teflon coating on your pan and the C8 used to manufacture it are not the same thing. C8 was what chemists call a processing aid. Think of it like the scaffolding used to construct a building. Once the building is complete, the scaffolding is supposed to come down. Except C8 didn't come down, not completely. And the C8 that didn't end up in the final product, it had to go somewhere. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what makes these chemicals, what scientists now call PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, so fundamentally different from almost anything else humans have ever created. The carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest in organic chemistry. When you line up fluorine atoms along a carbon chain, you create a molecular armour that nature has almost no tools to break apart. Bacteria can't eat it, sunlight can't degrade it, water can't dissolve it away. This is why scientists started calling them forever chemicals. It's not hyperbole, it's not activist language. It's a literal description of their behaviour in the environment. A molecule of C8 released into a river in 1951 is, in all likelihood, still out there somewhere today. Maybe it's in groundwater, maybe it's in soil, maybe it's in someone's bloodstream. The same properties that made PFAS chemicals so valuable, their ability to resist everything, made them impossible to get rid of. But in the 1950s, no one was thinking about that. They were thinking about the future, and what a future it seemed to be. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Teflon transformed American domestic life. Non-stick cookware went from luxury novelty to kitchen staple. Homemakers marvelled at pans that cleaned with a simple wipe. The technology spread beyond the kitchen into industrial coatings, into waterproof fabrics, into stain-resistant carpets and upholstery. The advertisements from this era are almost painful to watch now. Smiling housewives in perfect kitchens, gleaming pans that promised liberation from drudgery. The tagline wasn't spoken, but it hummed beneath every image. Chemistry is your friend. Science is making your life better. Trust the experts. DuPont positioned itself as the benevolent wizard behind the curtain. Better things for better living through chemistry. That was their slogan. And for a while, it seemed true. By the 1970s, PFAS-based technologies had penetrated almost every corner of consumer and industrial life. Scotchgard made your couch resistant to spills. Gore-Tex made your jacket resistant to rain. Firefighting foams used PFAS compounds to smother fuel fires at airports and military bases. Fast food wrappers were coated with PFAS to keep grease from soaking through. The miracle material was everywhere, invisible, working silently to make modern life more convenient. Some empires are built on oil, some are built on steel. This one was built on a molecule designed to never react with anything, and in its own way that made it the most dangerous empire of all, because the very thing that made C8 so useful was the thing that made it so persistent. And the very thing that made it so persistent was the thing that made it so difficult to detect, to track, to understand. For decades, the people living in the shadow of Washington Works had no idea what was accumulating in their water, their soil, their bodies. They trusted the plant. They trusted the company. They trusted the regulatory system that was supposed to protect them. That trust was about to be tested in ways no one anticipated. But first, we need to follow the chemical itself. Because C8 didn't just stay inside the factory walls, it had its own journey to make, through pipes and smokestacks and drainage ditches, into the Ohio River, into wells and aquifers, into the bodies of tens of thousands of people who never asked to be part of this experiment. The disposal problem was always there, hiding in plain sight. If you create a substance that doesn't break down, you have to put it somewhere. And wherever you put it, it stays. Here is a truth that seems obvious only in retrospect. Every industrial process creates waste. The question is never whether there will be byproducts. The question is what you do with them. For most of the 20th century, American industry operated under a simple principle. The solution to pollution was dilution. You had waste, you dumped it in a river, the river carried it away, the ocean absorbed it. Problem solved. This worked, or seemed to work, for substances that nature could break down, organic compounds decomposed, heavy metals dispersed. The sheer volume of water in rivers and oceans diluted most contaminants to levels that didn't cause immediate obvious harm. But C8 didn't play by those rules. When Washington Works began using PFOA in its manufacturing process, the waste had to go somewhere, and it went everywhere. Some of it went into the air. The production process released C8 particles through smokestacks, where wind currents carried them across the surrounding landscape. They settled on farms and fields and rooftops, washed by rain into soil and streams. Some of it went into the water. Processed wastewater flowed through pipes into the Ohio River, that great artery of the American heartland. The river didn't care what it carried. It simply moved the molecules downstream, past water intake pipes for towns and cities that drew their drinking water from its flow. And some of it went into the ground. Solid waste and sludge containing C8 were disposed of in landfills, including an unlined landfill called Dry Run, located near the plant. From there, the chemical leached into groundwater, spreading through underground aquifers in patterns that would take decades to fully map. Picture the contamination as 3 highways leading out of a single city: the air highway, the water highway, the ground highway, each carrying the same passenger to different destinations, but all those destinations eventually converged on the same endpoint: the bodies of the people who lived in the Mid-Ohio Valley. The community of Lubeck, West Virginia, drew its water from wells. Those wells tapped into aquifers that lay in the path of groundwater flowing from DuPont's disposal sites. The Little Hocking Water Association across the river in Ohio pulled its water from wells near the banks of the Ohio River, wells that were increasingly influenced by what flowed in that river and what seeped through the surrounding soil. These weren't large cities with sophisticated water treatment systems. They were small communities, working-class towns where people trusted that the water coming out of their taps was safe. Why wouldn't they? That's what the government was for. That's what regulations were for. Except the regulations didn't exist. Here's a fact that still stuns people when they first encounter it. For most of the time that DuPont was using and disposing of C8, there were no federal regulations specifically limiting PFOA in drinking water. None. The Safe Drinking Water Act, passed in 1974, gave the EPA authority to set standards for contaminants. But the EPA can only regulate what it knows about, and for decades, the agency had little visibility into what C8 was, where it was going, or what it might be doing to human health. This wasn't necessarily because of malicious intent. The regulatory system was designed to be reactive, not proactive. A chemical had to be identified as a problem before standards could be developed. Testing had to be conducted, studies had to be funded and completed, rules had to go through lengthy bureaucratic processes. Meanwhile, the chemical kept flowing. By the 1980s, tens of thousands of pounds of C8 had been released into the environment around Washington Works. The exact figures would later become the subject of litigation and dispute, but the scale was enormous by any measure. This wasn't a small leak. This was an ongoing industrial operation disposing of waste the same way American industry had always disposed of waste. Except, this particular waste was unlike anything the environment had encountered before. Inside the company, knowledge was accumulating. DuPont was a sophisticated chemical manufacturer with extensive research capabilities. The company conducted studies on C8. It monitored workers who handled the substance. It tracked health outcomes. It measured blood levels. What did they know, and when did they know it? This question would eventually become the central battleground in years of litigation. Documents that emerged through legal discovery painted a picture of growing internal awareness. Memos about blood contamination in workers, studies about potential health effects, discussions about the persistence of the chemical in the environment. But here's where the story gets complicated, and where dramatic irony begins to build. The communities around Washington Works knew none of this. They couldn't know. They had no access to internal company documents. They had no independent testing of their water supplies, for a chemical that most commercial labs couldn't even detect. They had no regulatory agency sounding alarms because no alarms had been officially set. They just lived their lives. They drank their water. They watered their gardens. They filled their children's pools. They made coffee and soup and ice cubes. They showered and bathed and brushed their teeth. Every day, with every glass of water, C8 molecules entered their bodies. And because C8 doesn't break down and doesn't flush out quickly, those molecules accumulated. The half-life of PFOA in human blood, the time it takes for half of it to leave your system, is measured in years, not days or weeks. The people of the Mid-Ohio Valley were becoming, without their knowledge or consent, subjects in an uncontrolled experiment. Their bodies were accumulating a synthetic chemical at concentrations far above anything found in the general population. And still, no one outside the factory walls understood what was happening. The situation might have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected catalyst. The revelation wouldn't come from regulators or scientists or investigative journalists. It would come from a farmer whose cows were dying. The contamination had been invisible for so long precisely because C8 is invisible. Colourless, odourless, tasteless. You can't see it in your water. You can't smell it in your air. You can only detect it with sophisticated chemical analysis that most people had no reason to request. But cows don't file complaints. They just get sick. And when enough of them got sick on a single farm near the Washington Works plant, their owner started asking questions that no one had asked before. Those questions would crack open a story that had been building for half a century. And once the crack appeared, the entire structure of silence would begin to crumble. Earl Tennant was not a scientist. He was not an activist. He was a cattle farmer in Parkersburg, West Virginia, a man who had spent his life reading the land and the animals that lived on it. In the early 1990s, his cows started dying. Not one or two, dozens. They died strangely, staggering, foaming, wasting away. Tennant performed amateur autopsies on his own animals, documenting blackened teeth, greenish organs, tumours in places tumours shouldn't be. He filmed the creek that ran through his property, capturing footage of water that foamed unnaturally, of cattle that refused to drink from streams they had always drunk from. Something was deeply wrong, and Tennant was convinced he knew the source. His property sat adjacent to a landfill where DuPont had disposed of waste from the Washington Works plant. The company had purchased land from the Tennant family years earlier, specifically for disposal purposes. Now the runoff from that landfill was flowing into the creeks that watered his farm. Tennant tried the obvious routes first. He contacted the state environmental agency. He contacted DuPont directly. He got nowhere. The company denied responsibility. The regulators seemed uninterested or overwhelmed. So Tennant did something that would change everything. He called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. Through a family connection, he reached Robert Billott, an attorney at a Cincinnati firm called Taft, Stettinius & Hollister. Billott was a corporate defense lawyer, and specifically, he had spent years defending chemical companies in environmental cases. He knew how these companies operated. He knew their legal strategies. He knew the science they used and the arguments they made. He was, in other words, an unlikely champion for a West Virginia cattle farmer fighting DuPont. But Billott took the call, and when he watched Earl Tennant's homemade videotapes of dying cows and contaminated streams, something shifted. Here was a man with no resources, no expertise, no powerful connections, facing off against one of the largest chemical companies in the world. The asymmetry was almost absurd. Billott agreed to take the case. What began as a wrongful death lawsuit for cattle would eventually unravel into one of the most significant environmental contamination cases in American history. But first, Billott had to figure out what was actually in the water. This turned out to be harder than expected. DuPont wasn't volunteering information. The regulatory agencies had limited data. The landfill contained decades of industrial waste, and identifying specific contaminants required the kind of detailed analysis that wasn't readily available. Billott did what lawyers do. He filed discovery requests, he demanded documents, and over months and years, boxes began arriving at his office, tens of thousands of pages of internal DuPont records, scientific studies, memos, reports. The more he read, the more alarmed he became. The documents revealed a chemical he had never heard of, PFOA, C8. They revealed that DuPont had been tracking this substance for decades. They showed internal studies on worker health, on animal testing, on environmental persistence. They showed calculations of how much C8 was being released, where it was going, what it was contaminating. And perhaps most damningly, they showed that the company had reasons to be concerned about human health effects long before any public disclosure. One memo from the 1980s discussed elevated rates of birth defects among children of female workers at Washington Works. Another documented C8 contamination in the blood of plant employees. Internal communications debated whether and how to inform regulators. Studies tracked the half-life of PFOA in human bodies, years, not weeks. Billott realized he wasn't looking at a simple cattle contamination case anymore. He was looking at evidence of potential human exposure on a massive scale. An entire community drinking water contaminated with a chemical that the manufacturer knew was accumulating in human blood. In 2001, Billott sent a letter to the EPA. It wasn't an ordinary legal filing. It was a detailed summary of what the DuPont documents revealed about C8, its persistence, its presence in water supplies, the internal studies suggesting potential health effects. The letter essentially handed the federal government a roadmap to a contamination crisis that had been invisible for half a century. The EPA took notice. In 2004, the agency filed a complaint against DuPont, alleging that the company had failed to report substantial risk information about PFOA as required under the Toxic Substances Control Act. This wasn't a finding of liability for health damage that would require different proceedings, but it was a formal recognition that something had gone seriously wrong in how this chemical had been handled. DuPont eventually agreed to a consent order and paid penalties. But the regulatory action was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. By this time, the scope of contamination was becoming clearer. Testing revealed that water supplies serving tens of thousands of people in the Mid-Ohio Valley contained detectable levels of C8. These weren't trace amounts at the edge of detection. These were concentrations that stood out, that raised questions, that demanded answers. The communities affected weren't abstractions on a map. They were real towns filled with real people who had been drinking this water for years, in some cases for their entire lives. They were people who now had to wonder, what had this chemical done to their bodies? What was it doing right now? The cattle farmers' lawsuit had opened a door. Now a flood of human plaintiffs wanted to walk through it. A class action began to take shape, representing thousands of residents who had consumed C8, contaminated water, from specific water districts in West Virginia and Ohio. The case was called Leach versus DuPont, named after one of the lead plaintiffs. The litigation could have followed the typical pattern of mass tort cases: years of motions and counter-motions, expert battles, eventual settlement with sealed terms and no admission of wrongdoing. That was the playbook. That was how chemical companies had handled contamination cases for decades. But something unusual happened in the C8 litigation, something that would make this case different from almost any that came before. When settlement negotiations began, the plaintiffs' attorneys didn't just ask for money. They asked for something that DuPont had always controlled: the science itself. The resulting agreement, finalized in 2004, included an unprecedented provision. DuPont would fund an independent scientific study of the affected population. A panel of epidemiologists, chosen jointly by both sides but operating independently, would have access to study the health of people who had been exposed to C8 in their drinking water. The science panel would investigate whether there were probable links between C8 exposure and human diseases. This was not the company commissioning its own research. This was not a regulatory agency conducting limited testing. This was an independent body, funded by the defendant, with the authority to reach conclusions that could directly impact future litigation. DuPont agreed to this provision. Perhaps they believed the science would vindicate them. Perhaps they calculated that the certainty of this process was preferable to the uncertainty of juries making decisions based on competing expert witnesses. Whatever the reasoning, they signed. The trapdoor was set. The science panel began its work, and the people of the Mid-Ohio Valley waited to learn what had been done to them. To understand why the science panel mattered, you need to understand how chemical companies had traditionally defended themselves against claims of health damage. The playbook was well established. When plaintiffs alleged that a chemical had caused their cancer or their kidney disease or their thyroid problems, the company would respond with a simple argument: prove it. Prove that this specific chemical caused this specific illness in this specific person. That's harder than it sounds. Much harder. Human diseases have multiple causes. Cancer can result from genetics, lifestyle, environmental factors, random cellular mutations, or some combination of all of these. Isolating a single chemical as the definitive cause of a single person's illness is scientifically challenging, and legally even more so. Companies would hire their own experts to testify that the science was uncertain, that correlation wasn't causation, that the plaintiffs couldn't meet their burden of proof. They would bury opposing experts in methodological critiques. They would fund studies designed to create doubt rather than clarity. This strategy worked. It worked for tobacco. It worked for asbestos, at least for a while. It worked for countless industrial chemicals that were later found to be harmful. The uncertainty itself became a shield. But the C8 settlement created a different dynamic. By agreeing to fund an independent science panel, DuPont had effectively agreed to let someone else define what the science said. Not their own experts. Not plaintiffs' hired guns. Independent epidemiologists with no stake in the outcome. The panel consisted of 3 scientists, epidemiologists with expertise in environmental health. Their task was to study the population that had been exposed to C8 contaminated water and determine whether there were probable links between that exposure and specific diseases. The standard they used, probable link, was carefully defined. It meant that, based on the weight of available scientific evidence, it it was more likely than not that C8 exposure was capable of causing a particular disease in the exposed population. This wasn't the same as proving that C8 had definitely caused any individual's illness. But it was a finding that could support such claims in subsequent litigation. The study that followed was massive in scope. More than 69,000 people participated. They filled out health surveys. They provided blood samples. They gave the science panel access to their medical histories. This was one of the largest epidemiological studies ever conducted on a chemically exposed population. For 7 years, the panel collected data, analysed patterns, compared the health of highly exposed individuals to those with lower exposure, and reviewed the existing scientific literature on PFOA. During those 7 years, life continued in the Mid-Ohio Valley. People went to work and raised families and watched their children grow. Some of them got sick. Some of them wondered if the water they had trusted was responsible. Some of them died without ever learning what the science panel would find. The waiting itself was a kind of torture. To know that you had been exposed to something, to know that scientists were studying whether that something had harmed you, and to have no control over the timeline or the outcome, this was the reality for tens of thousands of people. DuPont, meanwhile, continued operating. Washington Works kept producing. The company maintained that C8 was safe, that there was no proven link to human disease, that they had always acted responsibly. They were waiting too, perhaps confident that the science would support their position. The first findings began to emerge in 2011. The science panel announced a probable link between C8 exposure and kidney cancer. This was not a minor finding. Kidney cancer is a serious, often fatal disease. The panel had determined that the evidence supported a connection between the chemical that DuPont had been releasing for decades and this specific form of cancer in the exposed population. Then came the second finding, testicular cancer. 2 cancers now, 2 malignancies linked to a chemical that had flowed through the pipes and smokestacks of Washington Works into the water and air and soil, into the bodies of people who had never been asked whether they wanted to participate in this experiment. The findings continued. Ulcerative colitis, a chronic inflammatory bowel disease that can cause severe pain, bleeding, and long-term complications. Thyroid disease, a category that includes conditions affecting the gland that regulates metabolism, energy, and numerous body functions. Pregnancy-induced hypertension, including preeclampsia, a dangerous condition that can threaten the lives of both mother and child. High cholesterol, specifically elevated levels that the panel determined were linked to C8 exposure independent of other factors. 6 probable links in total. 6 categories of human disease that the independent science panel concluded were connected to C8 exposure. The findings landed like a verdict, even though they weren't technically verdicts at all. They were scientific conclusions, carefully worded and methodologically rigorous. But their implications were unmistakable. For decades, the communities around Washington Works had been told, implicitly or explicitly, that the plant was safe, that the water was fine, that there was nothing to worry about. Now, an independent body, funded by DuPont itself as part of a legal settlement, had concluded that the chemical released by that plant was probably linked to cancers and chronic diseases. The people who had lived with uncertainty now had something worse: confirmation. Think about what it means to learn that the water you drank every day, the water you gave your children, the water you used to cook and clean and bathe, that this water contained a chemical linked to cancer. Think about the parents who had to wonder whether their child's illness might have been prevented. Think about the spouses who had lost partners to kidney cancer, who now had to consider that the death might not have been random misfortune but the consequence of corporate decisions made decades earlier. The science panel findings didn't just change the legal landscape, they changed how an entire community understood its own history, and they opened the floodgates for litigation. Under the terms of the original settlement, the probable link findings meant that individual plaintiffs could now pursue personal injury claims against DuPont. The science was no longer uncertain. The company could no longer hide behind a fog of competing experts and unresolved questions. Thousands of lawsuits were filed. Each plaintiff had their own story, their own diagnosis, their own family shattered by disease. But they were all connected by the same thread: C8 in their blood, C8 in their water, C8 released by a company that had known for decades that this chemical was accumulating in human bodies. The trials began, and in the courtrooms of Ohio and West Virginia, The empire that had been built on a molecule designed to never react was finally being forced to react to what it had done. The first bellwether trial began in September 2015. The plaintiff was a woman named Carla Bartlett. She had been diagnosed with kidney cancer at age 45, a relatively young age for a disease that typically strikes later in life. She had lived in the mid-Ohio Valley for decades. She had drunk the water. Bellwether trials serve a specific function in mass litigation. When thousands of plaintiffs have similar claims, courts select a handful of representative cases to try first. The outcomes help both sides evaluate the strength of their positions and often guide settlement negotiations for the remaining cases. For DuPont, these trials represented an existential test. The science panel had made its findings, but findings aren't verdicts. The company would argue that even if C8 could cause kidney cancer in general, there was no proof it had caused this particular plaintiff's cancer. The old playbook, adapted for new circumstances. For the plaintiffs, the trials were an opportunity to tell their stories in public, to hold DuPont accountable in a forum where corporate resources couldn't simply overwhelm individual voices. The courtroom was the one place where a farmer or a factory worker or a school teacher could demand answers from one of the most powerful chemical companies in the world. The Bartlett trial lasted 3 weeks. Jurors heard testimony from scientists, from doctors, from DuPont executives. They reviewed internal documents that had been sealed for decades. They learned about the memos and studies and calculations that showed what the company had known and when. And then they deliberated. The verdict came back. $1.6 million in compensatory damages. The jury had found that Carla Bartlett's kidney cancer was linked to her exposure to C8 in drinking water, and that DuPont was responsible. One trial, one verdict. But its implications rippled outward. DuPont appealed, as corporations always do, but the verdict stood as a proof of concept. Juries could be convinced. The science panel findings could translate into courtroom accountability. The company's decades of confident denials could crumble under the weight of their own documents. A second bellwether trial followed in 2016. This plaintiff was David Freeman, who had also developed testicular cancer. The jury awarded $5.1 million, including $500,000 in punitive damages, a signal that the jurors wanted to punish the company, not just compensate the victim. A third trial. Another kidney cancer plaintiff, Kenneth Vineron. Another verdict for the plaintiff. $12.5 million, including $10.5 million in punitive damages. 3 trials, 3 losses for DuPont, combined verdicts exceeding $19 million for just 3 plaintiffs out of more than 3,500 pending cases. The mathematics were becoming uncomfortable for the company. If juries continued finding liability at this rate, if punitive damages continued escalating, the total exposure could reach into the billions. And beyond the financial calculation, there was reputational damage. Each trial generated headlines. Each verdict reminded the public of what had been done to the people of the mid-Ohio Valley. Inside DuPont's legal team, the calculation was shifting. The old playbook, delay, deny, defend, was designed for a world where the science was murky and plaintiffs struggled to prove causation. But the science panel had changed the equation. The company had agreed to let independent scientists define the science, and those scientists had not been kind. Settlement discussions intensified. In February 2017, DuPont and Chemours, the spin-off company that now operated Washington Works, announced a global settlement. They would pay $670.7 million to resolve approximately 3,550 personal injury lawsuits related to C8 contamination. $670 million. The number was staggering, one of the largest environmental contamination settlements in American history. It represented the accumulated weight of decades of decisions to use C8, to dispose of it in ways that contaminated water supplies, to continue operations even as the internal evidence of risk accumulated. But here's the uncomfortable truth about mass tort settlements. The money gets divided. The $670.7 million covered more than 3,500 plaintiffs. After attorneys' fees and administrative costs, individual payments varied widely based on the severity of illness, the strength of evidence, and numerous other factors. Some plaintiffs received substantial sums. Others received far less than their medical bills. No amount of money can truly compensate for cancer. No settlement can restore the years lost to chronic illness or the anxiety of wondering whether every ache and pain might be the first sign of something worse. The settlement was accountability of a sort, but it was also a negotiated ending, a way for the company to draw a line under the litigation and move forward. And DuPont did move forward, in a very particular way. In 2015, notably before the bellwether trials concluded and before the final settlement, DuPont had executed a corporate restructuring. The company spun off its performance chemicals division into a new, separate entity called Chemours. Chemours inherited Washington Works. It inherited the manufacturing operations that used fluorochemicals, and critically, it inherited certain liabilities associated with those operations. The spin-off was presented as a routine corporate reorganization, the kind of thing large companies do all the time to streamline operations and create shareholder value. But the timing raised eyebrows. Here was DuPont, facing potentially billions in liability from C8 litigation, creating a separate company that would assume responsibility for the contaminated facility. Was this prudent business planning? Was it an attempt to shield the parent company from future claims? The answer depends on whom you ask. What's undeniable is that the spin-off complicated accountability. After 2015, people asking who is responsible for C8 contamination had to navigate a corporate structure that included old DuPont, new DuPont, Chemours, and eventually, after the 2017 merger with Dow Chemical, an even more complex web of successor entities. The names on the buildings changed. The corporate org charts became labyrinths. But the chemical was still in the ground, still in the water, still in the blood of people who'd been drinking it for decades. And the science panel findings remained. The verdicts remained. The settlement, for all its limitations, represented an admission that something had gone terribly wrong. The C8 story could have ended there, a regional contamination case, resolved through litigation, consigned to legal history. But that's not what happened. Because even as the Mid-Ohio Valley settlements were being finalized, scientists and regulators were beginning to realize something disturbing. The problem wasn't limited to one plant in West Virginia. It wasn't limited to one chemical. The PFAS family included thousands of compounds, used in facilities across the country and around the world. The C8 story wasn't ending. It was just beginning to go national. In the years following the science panel findings and the bellwether verdicts, a remarkable transformation occurred. Not in the contaminated communities, the C8 was still in their water, still in their blood, still doing whatever it was doing to their bodies. The transformation happened in corporate boardrooms and on stock exchange tickers. The empire was reorganizing. To understand what happened, you need to appreciate the scale of what DuPont had become by 2015. This was not a single product company. DuPont was a diversified chemical giant with operations spanning agriculture, electronics, nutrition, and industrial materials. Teflon and related fluoropolymers were just one piece of a massive portfolio. The Performance Chemicals division, home to Washington Works and the C8 liabilities, represented real revenue but also represented real risk. The litigation was ongoing. The science panel findings had established probable links. Jury verdicts were going against the company. The potential exposure ran into billions. In July 2015, DuPont announced the spin-off of Chemours. The new company would take over the titanium technologies and fluoroproducts businesses. It would operate Washington Works, and it would assume certain environmental and legal liabilities associated with those operations. The separation agreement between DuPont and Chemours ran hundreds of pages. It allocated assets and liabilities, defined indemnification obligations, specified who would pay for what in various contamination scenarios. These documents were the product of armies of lawyers and accountants, carefully constructed to manage risk. From DuPont's perspective, this was sound corporate strategy. Separate the legacy liabilities from the core business, allow each entity to focus on its strengths, create shareholder value through specialization. From the perspective of people still living with C8 in their water, it looked different. The company that had contaminated their community was subdividing itself. The deep pockets that might pay future claims were being partitioned behind corporate walls. Chemours went public in July 2015. It was by design a smaller company than its parent, more exposed to the fluorochemicals market and the liabilities that came with it. Within 2 years, the picture grew even more complex. In December 2015, DuPont and Dow Chemical announced a merger, a combination of two of the largest chemical companies in the world. The deal closed in September 2017, creating DuPont, a behemoth valued at over $130 billion. But DuPont was designed from the start to be temporary. The merged entity would split into three separate companies, each focused on a different sector: agriculture, materials science, and specialty products. By 2019, the separation was complete. Corteva Agriscience took the agricultural businesses, Dow Incorporated took the materials science operations, and a new DuPont focused on specialty products, electronics, transportation, construction. Follow the shell game if you can. The DuPont that contaminated the Mid-Ohio Valley with C8 for 50 years was now what exactly? It had spun off Chemours, it had merged with Dow, it had split again into Corteva and the new DuPont and the new Dow. The original entity had been sliced and recombined so many times that tracing responsibility became an exercise in corporate archaeology. This matters because accountability requires someone to be accountable. When a plaintiff sues over environmental contamination, they need a defendant, an entity with assets that can satisfy a judgment. Corporate restructuring can complicate that picture, making it harder to determine who inherited which liabilities, whose insurance applies, whose bank accounts are reachable. To be clear, there's nothing inherently illegal about corporate reorganization. Companies restructure for many legitimate reasons, and the various separation agreements did include provisions for handling legacy liabilities. But the timing and complexity of these transactions created a practical reality. The company that had made the decisions, that had used C8, disposed of it in specific ways, delayed disclosure of internal research, that company no longer existed as a unified entity. In its place stood a constellation of successor corporations, each with its own legal identity, its own assets, its own arguments about the scope of its responsibility. Chemours, as the entity most directly connected to the fluorochemicals business, bore the most immediate exposure. In 2017, the company contributed to the $670.7 million settlement. In subsequent years, it faced additional litigation and regulatory action related to PFAS contamination, not just from C8, but from newer compounds that had replaced it. Because here's another layer of the story. The industry didn't stop using PFAS after the C8 crisis emerged. When concerns about PFOA intensified, manufacturers shifted to replacement chemicals, other fluorinated compounds with slightly different structures. DuPont and Chemours promoted a substance called Gene X as a safer alternative, but Gene X turned out to have its own problems. In 2017, it was detected in the Cape Fear River in North Carolina, downstream from a Chemours facility. The chemical had been in the water supply for years without the community's knowledge, an eerie echo of the C8 story playing out in a different state, with a different compound but the same fundamental pattern. The replacement chemical was contaminating a new community. The same company, now under a new corporate structure, was at the center of new allegations. The cycle was repeating. Meanwhile, scientific understanding of PFAS continued to evolve. Researchers were finding these chemicals everywhere, not just near manufacturing plants, but in water systems across the country. Military bases that had used PFAS-containing firefighting foam, airports, industrial facilities of various kinds, landfills where consumer products containing PFAS had been disposed. The C8 story had always been framed as a regional crisis. One plant, one river valley, one affected population. But as testing expanded, a different picture emerged. PFAS contamination wasn't an exception. It was widespread, perhaps ubiquitous. The chemicals that made Teflon possible were now detectable in the blood of virtually every American. The Mid-Ohio Valley wasn't an isolated case study, it was a preview. The first community to document what PFAS exposure could do to human health, the first to fight through the legal system for accountability. They had inadvertently become pioneers in a national reckoning that was only beginning. The science panel's 6 probable links weren't just findings about one contaminated water supply. They were warnings about a class of chemicals embedded throughout modern life. And the corporate restructuring that scattered DuPont into fragments wasn't just one company's liability management strategy. It was a preview of the accountability challenges that would arise as more communities discovered PFAS in their own water, their own soil, their own blood. The empire hadn't just reorganized, It had shown how difficult it would be to hold any chemical empire accountable when the contamination is everywhere and the corporate structures are endlessly mutable. For years, the people of the Mid-Ohio Valley had carried a strange burden. They were the ones who knew. They knew what it felt like to discover that the water you trusted was poisoned. They knew the anxiety of waiting for science panel findings. They knew the frustration of fighting a corporate giant through years of litigation. And they knew something else. They weren't special, not in the way that mattered. The same chemicals that had contaminated their water supplies were being used in facilities across the country. The same disposal practices, dumping waste in landfills, releasing it into waterways, venting it into air, had been standard industry procedure for decades. If C8 was in their blood, it was probably in other people's blood too. They were right. As testing capabilities improved and awareness spread, PFAS contamination began surfacing everywhere. Hoosick Falls, New York, Bennington, Vermont, Parchment, Michigan, Horsham, Pennsylvania. Communities that had never heard of C8 or PFOA were suddenly discovering these chemicals in their drinking water at levels that raised alarms. The sources varied. Some contamination traced to manufacturing facilities similar to Washington Works, but a significant portion came from a different vector entirely: firefighting foam, aqueous film-forming foam, AFFF, had been the gold standard for extinguishing fuel fires since the 1970s. Military bases used it, airports used it, industrial facilities used it, fire departments trained with it. The foam worked by spreading a thin film over burning fuel, cutting off oxygen and suppressing vapors. What made AFFF so effective? PFAS. The same properties that made these chemicals useful for non-stick coatings. Their resistance to heat and their ability to repel both water and oil made them ideal for firefighting applications. The foam could float on jet fuel, smothering flames that water alone couldn't touch. For decades, this foam had been sprayed during fires, during training exercises, during equipment tests. It had soaked into soil. It had run off into streams and ponds. It had leached into groundwater. Every military base with a fire station, every airport with a crash response team, every municipal fire department that had ever trained with AFFF. These were potential PFAS contamination sites, thousands of them, scattered across all 50 states. The map of contamination kept expanding. Environmental working groups began compiling databases. Investigative journalists filed Freedom of Information requests. State agencies started testing water supplies they had never tested before. The numbers were staggering. By the early 2000s, PFAS had been detected in the drinking water of communities serving tens of millions of Americans. The contamination wasn't limited to industrial areas or military bases. It was showing up in suburban water districts, in rural wells, in places that seemed to have no obvious source. Because PFAS didn't just stay where you put them. They travelled. They persisted. A molecule released decades ago could still be circulating through groundwater, still working its way towards someone's kitchen tap. And it wasn't just PFOA anymore. The PFAS family includes thousands of different compounds. When industry phased out C8 under regulatory pressure, they often replaced it with other PFAS chemicals, shorter-chain compounds that were marketed as safer alternatives. But safer is a relative term, and many of these replacement chemicals turned out to have their own problems. PFOS, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, emerged as another chemical of concern. Like PFOA, it was persistent, bioaccumulative, and associated with potential health effects. It was a key ingredient in many firefighting foams. GenX, the compound Chemours promoted as its C8 replacement, was detected in North Carolina drinking water. Studies began raising questions about its safety profile. The regulatory system, designed to evaluate chemicals one at a time through lengthy bureaucratic processes, was overwhelmed. There were too many PFAS compounds, too little data on most of them, and too much contamination already in the ground. The EPA had been studying PFAS for years, but progress was slow. The agency issued health advisories, non-binding recommendations about safe exposure levels, but these weren't enforceable standards. States grew impatient and began setting their own limits, creating a patchwork of regulations that varied wildly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some states set limits in the single digits of parts per trillion, extraordinarily low concentrations that reflected the growing scientific consensus that these chemicals were harmful even at minimal exposure levels. Other states had no specific PFAS regulations at all. Water utilities found themselves caught in the middle. Testing revealed PFAS in their supplies, but treatment was expensive and the regulatory landscape was uncertain. Should they invest millions in advanced filtration systems? Would those systems even work against all PFAS variants? Who would pay for the upgrades? The communities that had already lived through the C8 crisis watched this national awakening with a mixture of vindication and frustration. Vindication because their experience was finally being recognized as part of a larger pattern. Frustration because the same mistakes, delayed disclosure, regulatory gaps, corporate maneuvering, seemed to be repeating across the country. The science panel's 6 probable links had been specific to C8, but they cast a shadow over the entire PFAS class. If one forever chemical could cause kidney cancer and thyroid disease and ulcerative colitis, what about the thousands of related compounds now detected in water supplies nationwide? The research was ongoing, but the contamination wasn't waiting for conclusions. Every day, millions of Americans drank water containing PFAS chemicals, whose health effects were still being studied. They were living the same uncertainty that the Mid-Ohio Valley had lived for decades, the uncertainty of exposure without understanding, of risk without resolution. The C8 story had gone national. But going national meant the scale of the problem had grown beyond anything a single lawsuit or a single science panel could address. This was no longer about one company and one community. This was about an entire class of chemicals woven into the fabric of modern life, and about an entire country waking up to discover what had been flowing through their pipes all along. For 50 years, PFAS chemicals had existed in a regulatory void. They were manufactured, used, disposed of, and released into the environment with minimal federal oversight. The Safe Drinking Water Act gave the EPA authority to set standards, but the agency had never exercised that authority for PFOA, or PFOS, or any of their chemical cousins. That was about to change. The pressure had been building for years. Contaminated communities demanded action. State attorneys general filed lawsuits. Congressional hearings put EPA administrators in the hot seat, forcing them to explain why chemicals linked to cancer and other diseases remained unregulated in drinking water. The science was no longer ambiguous. The C8 science panel findings had been supplemented by dozens of additional studies. Research institutions around the world were publishing papers linking PFAS exposure to a growing list of health effects. The evidence base that regulators had once claimed was insufficient was now overwhelming. In 2021, the EPA announced a PFAS strategic roadmap, a plan to address these chemicals through a combination of research, regulation, and enforcement. It was a signal that the agency was finally treating PFAS as a priority, not just a problem to be studied indefinitely. The roadmap promised action: drinking water standards, cleanup requirements, restrictions on new PFAS releases. The question was whether the agency would follow through and how quickly. In March 2023, the EPA proposed the first ever national drinking water standards for PFAS. The proposed limits were strict: 4 parts per trillion for both PFOA and PFOS, with additional limits for other PFAS compounds. 4 parts per trillion. To understand how small that is, imagine a single drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's roughly the concentration the EPA was proposing as the maximum allowable level. It was an acknowledgement that these chemicals were harmful at almost any detectable amount. The proposal triggered fierce debate. Environmental advocates said the limits were overdue and necessary. Industry groups warned of enormous compliance costs, potentially billions of dollars for water utilities to install advanced treatment systems. Some questioned whether the science supported such stringent standards. The EPA held public hearings, it reviewed comments, it consulted with scientists and stakeholders. And in April 2024, the agency finalized the rule. The National PFAS Drinking Water Standards became law, the first federal limits ever imposed on these forever chemicals. PFOA and PFOS were each limited to 4 parts per trillion. Additional limits applied to 3 other PFAS compounds, with a combined standard for mixtures. Water utilities across the country were put on notice. They would need to test their supplies, report the results, and if contamination exceeded the limits, install treatment systems to reduce PFAS levels. The compliance timeline stretched over several years, acknowledging the scale of the infrastructure challenge. But the regulation existed. After half a century of PFAS contamination, the federal government had finally drawn a line. The timing was significant. By 2024, PFAS had been detected in water systems serving over 100 million Americans. The new standards would force utilities to address contamination that had previously gone unregulated, contamination that many communities didn't even know they had. Testing requirements alone would transform public awareness. Utilities that had never checked for PFAS would now be required to do so. Communities that assumed their water was clean might discover otherwise. The regulation would generate data, and that data would reveal the true scope of the national contamination. The standards also had teeth. Utilities that failed to comply faced enforcement action. The EPA could require corrective measures, impose penalties, and in extreme cases take over operations of systems that couldn't meet requirements. This was the regulatory infrastructure that had been missing throughout the C8 story. When Washington Works was releasing PFOA into the Ohio River, there was no federal limit being violated. The company could argue, and did argue, that it was operating within the legal framework of the time. The absence of regulation had provided cover. Now that cover was gone, any facility releasing PFAS into water supplies was on notice. Any contamination exceeding the new limits was, by definition, a regulatory violation requiring response. But regulation creates its own challenges. The 4 parts per trillion standard was strict, but achieving it required technology. Granular activated carbon filtration, ion exchange systems, high-pressure membrane systems. These weren't simple upgrades. They required capital investment, technical expertise, and ongoing operational costs. Small water utilities, the kind that serve rural communities and small towns, faced particular challenges. They often lacked the financial resources and technical capacity to install and operate advanced treatment systems. The same communities that were most vulnerable to contamination were often least equipped to address it. The EPA estimated compliance costs in the billions of dollars nationally. The question of who would pay loomed large. Would it be ratepayers, through higher water bills? Would it be taxpayers, through government subsidies? Would it be the companies that had manufactured and profited from PFAS chemicals? The last option, making polluters pay, was already being pursued through litigation, and the settlements that emerged would reshape the financial landscape of the PFAS crisis. In June 2023, just months after the EPA proposed its drinking water standards, 3 companies announced a landmark agreement. Chemours, DuPont and Corteva, the corporate descendants of the original DuPont that had manufactured C8, would contribute to a settlement fund addressing PFAS contamination in public water systems. The amount? $1.185 billion. The fund would help water providers across the country address PFAS contamination. It wasn't limited to communities near specific manufacturing facilities. It acknowledged the national scope of the problem and provided resources for utilities facing compliance costs under the new federal standards. This was different from the earlier C8 settlements, which had focused on personal injury claims from specific contaminated communities. The water system settlement addressed infrastructure, the physical challenge of removing PFAS from drinking water supplies serving millions of people. The settlement didn't resolve all claims. It didn't cover personal injury lawsuits, which continued separately. It didn't address contamination from other sources like military bases or firefighting foam manufacturers. But it represented a significant transfer of resources from the companies that had profited from PFAS to the utilities that now had to clean it up. More settlements followed. In August 2025, reports emerged of an $875 million PFAS settlement involving New Jersey, payments that would begin no sooner than January 2026. The state had been aggressive in pursuing PFAS claims, and the settlement reflected the continuing legal and financial reckoning. The numbers kept growing. Billions of dollars in settlements, billions more in projected compliance costs. The chemical that had been valued for its stability was proving extraordinarily expensive to address. Numbers have a way of becoming abstract at scale. $1 million is a fortune. $1 billion is a statistic. When we talk about PFAS settlements totaling billions, about compliance costs reaching tens of billions, the figures lose their human dimension. So let's bring it back to the human scale. Think about a family in Parkersburg, West Virginia. A family that drank contaminated water for 30 years without knowing it. The parents worked hard, paid their taxes, trusted their community and their government to keep them safe. They raise children in a home where the tap water carried an invisible passenger. Now imagine that one of those parents develops kidney cancer. The diagnosis comes like a thunderclap. The biopsies, the staging, the treatment options laid out in clinical language that barely conceals the terror underneath. Surgery, chemotherapy, the physical toll, the emotional devastation, the financial strain of medical bills even with insurance. This family follows the news. They know about the science panel findings. They know that kidney cancer is one of the 6 probable links. They know that the water they trusted was contaminated with C8. What is the cost of that knowledge? There's the direct cost, the medical expenses, the lost wages, the practical burdens of serious illness. These can be calculated, documented, presented in court. A settlement might compensate for some portion of these losses, but there's another cost that no settlement can address. The cost of wondering. Did the water cause this cancer? Would my spouse be healthy if we had lived somewhere else? Did I poison my own children by giving them tap water every day of their lives? This is the psychological burden that contaminated communities carry. Not just illness, but uncertainty. Not just exposure, but the knowledge of exposure. The awareness that something was done to you, that you were part of an experiment you never consented to, that the consequences may still be unfolding in your body and your children's bodies. Multiply that burden by tens of thousands of families in the Mid-Ohio Valley. Then multiply it again by the communities now discovering PFAS in their own water supplies. The scale of human anxiety is immeasurable. The settlements acknowledge harm, but they cannot undo it. The $670.7 million for C8 personal injury claims. The $1.185 billion for water systems. The $875 million for New Jersey. These numbers represent accountability of a sort, transfers of wealth from companies to communities, admissions that something went wrong, even without formal admissions of wrongdoing. But the money flows into a void that money cannot fill. Consider the water utilities now facing compliance with federal PFAS standards. A small town in Michigan discovers that its wells contain PFOA at 15 parts per trillion, nearly 4 times the new federal limit. The town has 5,000 residents. Its water system operates on a shoestring budget, funded by modest user fees. Installing a granular activated carbon treatment system might cost several $millions. Operating and maintaining it will add ongoing expenses indefinitely, because PFAS don't go away, and the treatment must continue as long as the contamination exists. Where does the money come from? The town can raise water rates, but its residents are already stretched thin. It can seek state or federal grants, but competition for those funds is fierce. It can join the litigation against PFAS manufacturers, hoping for a share of settlement funds, but that process takes years and outcomes are uncertain. Meanwhile, the water keeps flowing. The contamination continues. Every day without treatment is another day of exposure. This is the infrastructure challenge that federal regulation creates. Standards are necessary. Without them, contamination remains invisible and unaddressed. But standards without resources create an unfunded mandate, a requirement that communities address a problem they didn't cause and can't afford to fix. The settlement funds help, but they're not sufficient for the scope of the problem. The $1.185 billion for water systems sounds enormous until you divide it among thousands of affected utilities across the country. The math doesn't work. The contamination is too widespread, the treatment too expensive, the resources too limited, and this is just drinking water. The PFAS problem extends far beyond what comes out of the tap. Consider the farmers whose fields have been contaminated by biosolids, treated sewage sludge that was spread as fertilizer, carrying PFAS from countless sources into agricultural soil. Their crops absorb the chemicals, their livestock drink contaminated water, their livelihoods depend on products that may now be unsaleable. Consider the firefighters who trained with AFFF foam for decades, who were covered in the stuff during drills and emergencies, who have elevated PFAS levels in their blood and elevated rates of certain cancers. They were doing their jobs, protecting their communities, following standard protocols, and they were being poisoned by the tools they were given. Consider the military families who lived on bases where PFAS contamination has since been discovered. They trusted that the government providing their housing would also protect their health. Now they wonder what those years of exposure might mean for themselves and their children. The cost of forever chemicals is measured in dollars, but also in trust. Trust in corporations to operate safely. Trust in regulators to protect public health. Trust in the basic systems that are supposed to keep communities safe. That trust has been damaged, perhaps irreparably. When people discover that they've been exposed to harmful chemicals for years without their knowledge, they don't just lose faith in the specific company or agency responsible. They lose faith in the entire framework of oversight and accountability. This is why the C8 story matters beyond the specific communities affected. It's a case study in how industrial contamination happens, how it's concealed, how it's eventually revealed, and how difficult it is to achieve meaningful accountability even when the evidence is overwhelming. The science panel model, independent researchers funded by the defendant, reaching conclusions that bind future litigation, represented an innovation in toxic tort law. It short-circuited the usual battle of experts, creating a shared scientific foundation that both sides had agreed to accept. But that model emerged from a unique set of circumstances: a determined lawyer who stumbled onto internal documents, a class action that achieved certification, a settlement negotiation where plaintiffs had enough leverage to demand something unprecedented. These circumstances don't replicate easily. Most contaminated communities don't have a Robert Bylot. Most litigation settles quietly, with sealed terms and no admission of wrongdoing. The science panel was an exception, not a template, and so the fundamental problem persists. Companies can externalize the costs of contamination onto communities. Regulations lag behind industrial practices by decades. Accountability, when it comes, arrives too late to prevent harm and too limited to fully repair it. We began this story with a young mother in 1965, frying eggs in a miracle pan. The future had arrived in her kitchen, and it seemed like pure progress. Now we know what that progress cost. 60 years of contamination, tens of thousands of people exposed, 6 probable links to serious disease, billions of dollars in settlements and compliance costs, a regulatory system transformed by the failure to prevent what should have been preventable, and the chemical is still there. In the groundwater of the Mid-Ohio Valley, in aquifers beneath military bases and airports, in the blood of virtually every American, including newborns, including you, including me. This is what makes PFAS different from other contamination stories. When a tanker spills oil, the oil eventually breaks down. When a factory releases conventional pollutants, nature has tools to process them. The damage is real, but it's bounded by time. Given enough years, ecosystems recover. PFAS don't work that way. The carbon-fluorine bond that made these chemicals so valuable is the same bond that makes them essentially permanent. We don't have good ways to destroy them. We can filter them out of water, but then we have contaminated filters to dispose of. We can incinerate them at extreme temperatures, but that's expensive and energy-intensive and may create its own problems. The forever chemicals are, for practical purposes, forever. Every molecule of C8 that DuPont released into the environment over 50 years is still out there somewhere, cycling through water and soil and living organisms. The contamination isn't a past event. It's an ongoing condition. This forces an uncomfortable question. What do we do with a mistake that can't be undone? The legal system offers one answer: lawsuits, settlements, financial accountability for the companies that created and profited from these chemicals. The billions of dollars flowing from DuPont and Chemours and 3M and others represent a kind of justice, incomplete, delayed, but real. The regulatory system offers another answer: standards that limit future releases, requirements that force cleanup of existing contamination, rules that, if they had existed decades ago, might have prevented the crisis entirely. But neither answer addresses the fundamental problem. The chemicals are in the environment. They're in our bodies. They'll be there for generations. The best we can do now is manage a problem we cannot solve. This is the legacy of the C8 story. Not just the specific harm done to specific communities, but the broader lesson about the limits of our ability to control the consequences of our own ingenuity. We are very good at creating new chemicals. The PFAS family includes thousands of compounds, each with slightly different properties, each engineered for specific applications. Our ability to manipulate molecules at the atomic level is genuinely remarkable, a triumph of human intelligence and creativity. But we are much less good at understanding the long-term consequences of what we create. We release chemicals into the environment before we fully understand where they'll go, how they'll behave, what they'll do to living systems. We assume that the absence of obvious immediate harm means safety, when it might just mean that the harm is slow and subtle and cumulative. The precautionary principle suggests that we should require proof of safety before allowing widespread use of new chemicals. The current system largely does the opposite, allowing use until harm is proven, which can take decades. The C8 story is an argument for precaution. It shows what happens when a company knows more about a chemical's risks than the public, when that knowledge is not shared, when the regulatory system lacks the tools or the will to investigate, when contamination accumulates invisibly for years before anyone understands what's happening. But it's also a more humbling story than that. Even if DuPont had been transparent about everything it knew, even if regulators had been more aggressive, even if the affected communities had been warned, the fundamental problem would remain. We created a molecule that doesn't break down. We released it into an environment that has no tools to process it. We built an industrial system around its remarkable properties, without fully considering what those properties would mean over time. The Ohio River still flows past Washington Works. The plant still operates under new ownership, producing materials that modern life depends upon. The communities along its banks still draw their water, now filtered through systems designed to remove chemicals that shouldn't be there in the first place. The people who lived through the C8 crisis carry their exposure in their blood and their memories. Some of them are sick. Some of them are healthy but haunted by what might come. Some of them have died, their stories now told by family members and court records and scientific studies. They were the first to know what PFAS contamination means in human terms. Now the rest of the country is learning. The settlements will continue, the regulations will tighten, the science will advance. Slowly, painfully, expensively, we will address the contamination that already exists and try to prevent new contamination from occurring. But the forever chemicals will remain forever. That is their nature. That is our inheritance. The question the C8 story leaves us with is not whether we can fix this particular problem. It's whether we can learn from it, whether the next miracle material will be evaluated differently, whether the next company will behave differently, whether the next regulatory gap will be closed before, rather than after, the damage is done. History suggests skepticism. We have made these mistakes before, with asbestos and lead and DDT and countless other substances that seemed like progress until they revealed themselves as poison. Each time we say we've learned. Each time we make similar mistakes with different chemicals. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe the scale of the PFAS crisis, the visibility of the litigation, the undeniable evidence of harm will force genuine change in how we evaluate new chemicals before releasing them into the world. Or maybe, decades from now, another community will discover another invisible contaminant in their water, and another lawyer will uncover another cache of internal documents, and another science panel will announce another set of probable links. The only certain thing is that the molecules don't care about our legal system or our regulatory debates or our hopes for the future. They just persist, following the laws of chemistry, indifferent to the human consequences of their remarkable stability. Some empires are built on oil. Some are built on steel. This one was built on a chemical designed to never react. And that, in the end, is the problem. It never reacts. It never breaks down. It never goes away. It just stays in the water, in the soil, in our blood, asking a question that we still don't know how to answer. What happens when the most profitable chemistry is the one you can't put back in the bottle?